The life of a woman in 13th century France. Close your eyes. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are right now. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, from your chest, from all the places you didn't even realize you were holding tension. There's nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be. The only thing asked of you in this moment is to breathe slowly and to listen. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere far away. Not a dramatic place, not a grand palace, or a battlefield, or a bustling city full of noise and light. I want to take you somewhere quiet, somewhere small, a village at the edge of a forest in the heart of France, where the nights are long and the stars are thick overhead, and the only sound is the occasional low moan of wind coming down from the hills to the north. The year is somewhere around 1260. The world as we know it does not yet exist. There are no electric lights, no clocks ticking on the wall, no hum of refrigerators or distant traffic. There is only the dark and the fire and the slow breath of the earth turning toward morning. In a small house at the edge of this village, a woman named Eleanor is sleeping. She is lying on a straw pallet near the hearth, her wool blanket pulled up to her chin, her hands rough and calloused and folded against her chest. Her face, even in sleep, carries a kind of quiet strength, the kind you earn not through courage or ambition, but simply through surviving, one season after another, one loss after another. This is her story, and as you let it wash over you, I hope it carries you gently, the way a river carries a leaf, not rushing, not forcing, just slowly, patiently, all the way to sleep. Part 1. The world she was born into. Eleanor was born sometime around the year 1230. She never knew the exact date. Neither did her mother, really. In the village of Châtelier, a small, unremarkable cluster of perhaps 30 families tucked into the rolling fields of the Champagne region in northern France, birthdays were not carefully recorded. There was no priest with a ledger noting down the day and the hour. What mattered was the season. She came into the world in the early weeks of autumn, when the air was beginning to bite and the last of the harvest was being hauled in from the fields. Her mother always said she arrived with the smell of turned earth and wood smoke in the air, that she came into the world already knowing how to wait, patient as the season itself. The region of Champagne in the 13th century was a prosperous one by medieval standards. Its famous fairs at Troyes, Provence, Lagny, and Bar-sur-Aube were the commercial heartbeat of northern Europe, attracting merchants from Italy, Flanders, Germany, Spain, and beyond. Woolen cloth from the north met silk and spices from the Mediterranean. Money changed hands in quantities that would have astonished Eleanor if she had ever been told about it. She never was. The great fair at Troyes was perhaps 30 miles from her village, close enough that the road to it passed within a half-day's walk. But in practice, the distance between her world and that world was not measurable in miles. It was measurable in everything else, in literacy, in coin, in mobility, in the freedom to go somewhere because you wanted to rather than because your lord permitted it. Troyes might as well have been in another country, which, in a meaningful sense, it was. The France into which Eleanor was born was a country in the middle of what historians would later call the High Middle Ages, a period that stretched roughly from the year 1000 to 1300, and that represented in many ways the peak of medieval civilization. The great cathedrals were being built. The University of Paris had been operating since around 1150. King Louis IX, who would later be made a saint, sat on the throne in Paris, ruling over a kingdom that was slowly consolidating its power, pushing back against the nobility who had for so long fragmented France into dozens of half-independent territories. But none of that reached Châtelet. None of it touched the village in any meaningful way. What mattered to Eleanor's family, and to every family in the village, was the land. The eternal, demanding, beautiful, brutal land. Roughly 80 to 90% of all people in medieval France were peasants. This was not a word that carried contempt exactly, though it carried weight. It described a reality. You were a person of the land. Your identity, your entire existence, was bound up in soil and seed and seasons. The medieval world was organized according to a system historians call feudalism, a layered hierarchy in which the king sat at the very top, owning, at least in theory, all the land in the kingdom. Below him were the great nobles, the dukes and counts and powerful lords who held their territories from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them were smaller lords and knights, and at the very bottom, holding everything up, were the peasants. In practice, what this meant for Eleanor's village was a relationship with their lord, a mid-ranking nobleman whose name appears nowhere in any surviving record, because men like him rarely made history. He held the manor, which included the land of the village and the lands around it. He provided a degree of protection. He had a mill and an oven and a press for making wine. And in exchange for the right to farm small strips of land within the manor, the peasants of Châteliers owed him a great deal. Not in money usually, in labor, in grain, in the quiet, exhausting currency of their bodies. Eleanor's family were villains, which is to say, they were unfree peasants, technically bound to the land. They could not leave the manor without their lord's permission. They could not marry without it either. If the manor was sold, they went with it. They were not slaves exactly. They had rights of a sort, could appeal to the manorial court, could not simply be killed, but they were far from free. They occupied that difficult middle space that medieval society created and then mostly tried not to think too hard about. Her father was a man called Henry. He farmed about 12 acres of land, divided into strips across the 3 great fields of the village, the typical open field system of medieval France, where the arable land was divided into 3 sections that rotated between winter wheat, spring crops, and fallow in a 3-year cycle. This was clever, really. Leaving a third of the land to rest each year gave the soil a chance to recover. The peasants of the Middle Ages understood their land intimately, in the way you understand something you have touched every day of your life. They knew which fields drained well and which ones flooded in March. They knew the feel of good tilth between their fingers. They knew, without clocks or calendars, when the frost was finished and the earth was ready. Henry also kept a small plot of garden beside the house. A toft, it was called, where Eleanor's mother, a woman named Marguerite, grew cabbages and onions, leeks and peas, a few herbs like thyme and rue, and a tangle of woad from which a pale blue dye could be made. This little garden was almost entirely her mother's domain, and it was the first place young Eleanor was ever given real responsibility. By the time she was 5 or 6 years old, she was already pulling weeds, already learning to thin the seedlings, already developing the bent-back patience of someone who works close to the ground. She was the second of 4 children. Her older brother Gilles was already helping their father in the fields by the time Eleanor was old enough to form solid memories. Below her came a younger sister, Agnes, and then the youngest, a boy who had been given no name before he died, which happened in his 2nd week of life, which was not unusual, which was simply the kind of thing that happened in the year 1235 in a village in the Champagne. Her mother lit a candle for him at the church, said a prayer, got up the next morning, and went back to the garden. The village itself was a living thing, small and tight and interconnected. 30 families, perhaps 150 people in total, all of them knowing each other's business, all of them bound together by proximity and necessity and the shared labor of keeping themselves alive. There was one road, unpaved, that ran through the middle of the village and connected it, eventually, to the nearest market town about 6 miles to the east. There was a church at the center of the village, built of stone, which was unusual. Most of the buildings in Châtelier were made of wattle and daub, a framework of wooden stakes woven with thin branches, and then plastered over with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and dung. It was not elegant, but it was warm when the fire was going, and it kept the rain mostly out, and in a world where warmth and dryness were genuinely precious things, that was enough. Eleanor grew up in this world the way children grow up everywhere, not with a sense of hardship exactly, because hardship implies knowing something easier. She had no reference point for easier. She grew up with the smell of wood smoke and animals, the sound of bells from the church marking the hours of the day, the feel of cold mud under bare feet in early spring, the particular golden late afternoon light that came through the low doorway of the house and lay in a warm strip across the earthen floor. She grew up knowing her neighbors' names, knowing which family's pigs were which, knowing that old Bertrand the blacksmith had a bad temper in the mornings and a kind one by noon. She grew up memorizing the fields and the paths between them the way a child today might memorize a neighborhood. It was, in its strange and difficult way, a world she understood completely. And like all children everywhere and in every time, she thought it was ordinary. She thought it was simply the world. Part 2. The house at the edge of everything. Let me tell you what Eleanor's home looked like, because it was so different from anything most of us have ever known that it almost takes an active imagination to make it real. The house was a single room, one room for everything, for sleeping, for eating, for working, for sheltering animals in the worst winter months. It was perhaps 15 feet long and 12 feet wide. The walls were the wattle and daub construction I mentioned, covered on the outside with a pale yellowish plaster that showed the impression of the fingers that had smoothed it into place. The roof was thatch. Bundles of reeds or rye straw lay thick and overlapping, the way you might imagine a very rough and irregular haystack arranged to form a ceiling. A good thatched roof, properly maintained, could last 20 years. It was also wonderfully insulating, thick enough to keep a surprising amount of heat in during the winter and to keep the interior cooler in summer. There were no windows, or rather, there was one small opening in the wall, covered with a wooden shutter that could be latched closed against wind and rain. In the dark months, October through March, let's say, this shutter was almost always closed. The only light inside the house came from the central fire pit, which sat on the earthen floor roughly in the middle of the room, and from tallow candles or rushlight, which were used sparingly because tallow cost money. There was no chimney. The smoke from the fire rose toward the ceiling and slowly seeped out through gaps in the thatch and through the eaves. This meant the upper half of the interior was almost always thick with smoke. The walls and rafters were coated in a dark, greasy residue that built up over years. Medieval sermons, when they wanted to describe the inside of a peasant's home, often said simply that the hall was black with smoke. This was not metaphor. It was description, but the peasants had adapted to it. They worked and ate and slept lower to the ground, where the air was clearest and they barely noticed the haze above. The floor was earth, packed hard by years of use, sometimes swept, sometimes strewn with rushes or hay in winter to provide insulation and something softer underfoot. In spring, for the feast of Easter, Eleanor's mother would replace the old straw with fresh green rushes, which smelled clean and bright for a few days before the mud and the animals and the smoke turned them gray again. The furniture was minimal. A heavy wooden table with 2 benches, a storage chest, the family's most prized piece of furniture, in which wool, blankets, good clothing, and anything valuable were kept. Hooks along one wall held tools, harness, bags, hams and dried herbs and onions hung from the rafters, out of reach of rats. There were wooden bowls, earthenware jugs, a large iron pot that hung over the fire on a chain, a long-handled ladle, a crucifix on the wall above the door, a small clay figure of the Virgin Mary, probably not much larger than a hand, set on a shelf near the hearth, because the hearth was the heart of the home, and the Virgin was its patron. The animals did not always stay outside. In the coldest weeks of winter, when temperatures dropped sharply and the ground froze hard and the wind came howling down from the north, a family might bring their most valuable animals, the milk cow, the sheep if they had them, the pigs, into the house at night. The body heat of livestock is significant. In a space as small as Eleanor's family home, even one cow could raise the temperature several degrees, and the animals were too valuable to risk losing to frost. So they slept together, the family and the animals, in the thick smoke-darkened warmth of the house, and the smell was powerful and organic and simply normal. Eleanor's bed was a straw pallet on the floor near the fire. Her parents slept on a similar pallet, though theirs might have been raised slightly on a wooden frame. Her brother Gilles slept in a rough loft space accessed by a ladder, a platform built across one end of the house, just large enough for a sleeping body. When her sister Agnès was old enough to sleep apart from their mother, she shared Eleanor's pallet, the two of them wrapped together in a single wool blanket for warmth, their feet toward the dying fire, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Sleeping was different in the medieval world than it is now, not just in terms of comfort or warmth, but in its very structure. There is historical evidence, most famously in the work of the historian Roger Eckhart, to suggest that people in pre-industrial times often slept in 2 separate stretches. A first sleep that began shortly after dark, and a second sleep that lasted until dawn, with a period of wakeful rest in between. During this middle-of-the-night interval, people might pray or check on the fire or feed a baby or simply lie in a half-dreaming state of quiet. It was not insomnia. It was not a problem. It was just how sleep worked, when sleep was not governed by alarm clocks and artificial light, but by the natural rhythm of darkness and the body. Eleanor's family ate their main meal around midday when possible, though the exact timing depended entirely on the work of the season. In summer, during the long harvest days, the midday meal might be brought out to the fields, bread and ale, usually, maybe a bit of cheese. In winter, when the days were short and work was slower, everyone came back inside and ate together in the small, smoky warmth of the house. Supper, in the evening, was usually the leftovers of whatever had been cooked that morning, reheated over the fire. There was no separation between the kitchen and the living space and the sleeping space. All of it was the same room. All of it overlapped. Life in Eleanor's house was not divided into categories: work and rest, public and private, eating and sleeping. It was all one continuous thing, one continuous hum of existence in a very small space. The fire was never fully extinguished if it could be avoided. Coals were banked at night, covered with ash to hold their heat, and encouraged back to life in the morning. Losing your fire was a serious inconvenience, because making fire from scratch with a flint and steel was possible but slow, and in winter, the chill could set in quickly. The fire was the center of everything. It cooked the food, heated the space, provided the only reliable light after dark, and dried wet clothing hung near it on cold days. Eleanor spent a significant part of every day tending that fire, feeding it, adjusting its heat for whatever was cooking, making sure it stayed alive. In the evenings, after the work of the day was finished and the meal was eaten, the family sat near the fire. There was no entertainment in the modern sense. No books. None of them could read. No musical instruments usually, though sometimes someone might know a song. They talked. They mended clothing in the firelight. Eleanor's mother spun wool, carding it first, working the fibers into alignment with two flat paddles embedded with wire teeth, then spinning it on a simple drop spindle, the weighted wooden whorl, turning slowly, the thread drawing out long and fine between her practiced fingers. Later in Eleanor's life, spinning wheels became more common. The earliest visual depiction of a spinning wheel in Europe is a manuscript illustration from 1237, so right in the middle of Eleanor's lifetime. But her mother started with the old method, the drop spindle that women had used since before anyone could remember. This was how the evenings went, quietly, the fire popping, the spindle turning, the wind outside, the soft sound of animals settling, and gradually, one by one, the family dropping into sleep. Part 3. The weight of obligation. There is a scene that Eleanor must have lived through dozens of times, if not hundreds, and it is this. She is in the field at dawn, the sun barely up, the dew still heavy on the grass, and she is already working, already bending, or pulling, or carrying. Not because someone is watching her, not because she loves it, but because if she doesn't, something vital will not get done, and not getting vital things done has consequences that range from hunger to catastrophe. The medieval peasant's relationship with work is hard for modern people to fully comprehend. We work hard too, many of us, but our work generally ends. There are evenings, there are weekends, there are vacations. There is the idea, deeply embedded in modern culture, that work and rest exist in balance, and that rest is a legitimate and necessary thing. In Eleanor's world, rest was what you did when you literally could not do anything else. Rest was the unconscious state at the end of the day, The brief pause between one labor and the next. It was not leisure. Leisure was something that happened to other people, to the Lord in his manor, to the priest, to the rich merchants in the distant towns. Eleanor's family's obligations to their Lord were extensive and relentless. Under the medieval system of serfdom that characterized much of northern France in the 13th century, villains like Eleanor's family typically owed what was called corvée labor, free work on the Lord's land, in addition to farming their own strips. This might be 2 or 3 days a week during ordinary times, and as many as 5 days a week during the critical periods of planting and harvest, when the Lord's domain, his own personal fields, needed every available hand. During harvest season, the Lord's fields were worked first, always. Your own grain could wait while the Lord's grain was brought in. If the weather turned and you hadn't yet gathered your own crops because you'd spent the last 2 weeks bringing in his, well, that was not the Lord's problem. Beyond the labor owed directly, there were fees for everything. The Lord owned the mill, the only mill within the village's territory, and the right to grind grain into flour was his monopoly. Every household that brought grain to be milled owed a portion of the resulting flour to the miller, who paid the Lord. The Lord also owned the oven, the large communal bread oven that produced the heavy, dense loaves that formed the foundation of the peasant diet. To use the oven, you paid. He owned the wine press in regions where grapes were grown. You paid to use that too. He owned the fishing rights in the local streams. He owned the rights to the common woodland, gathering firewood, grazing animals on the common land. All of this was permitted, but permitted under conditions, and the conditions always included some form of payment. There was also the church tithe, 1/10 of everything you produced. Grain, livestock, dairy, everything went to the church. This was not optional. It was a religious obligation reinforced by social pressure and the genuine belief that paying it was necessary for the salvation of your soul. The local priest collected it. He was not necessarily unkind about it. Priests were community members too, often from peasant families themselves, and they understood the realities of village life. But the tithe was owed regardless of how the harvest had gone, regardless of whether you had enough left over for your family. It was owed. On top of all this, villains like Eleanor's family paid rent for the strips of land they farmed. And if a daughter wanted to marry, she needed the Lord's permission. And that permission came with a fee called the merchant. If a man died and left land to his children, the heir paid a fee called the heriot, typically the best animal the family owned, which was confiscated by the Lord as payment for the privilege of inheriting. The best ox, maybe, the best cow, gone in the moment when a family had just lost their father and was already grieving and frightened. The Lord's representative came and took the best animal away. This happened routinely. It was the system. Eleanor grew up understanding all of this not as injustice exactly, but as weather. You didn't argue with the weather. You planned around it. You endured it. You tried to produce enough that after all the obligations were met, there would be something left for the family. Some years there was, some years there wasn't. And in the years when there wasn't enough left, you ate less. You stretched the grain by mixing in beans and bran. You went to bed hungry on more nights than you cared to count. There were moments, of course, when the weight of it all felt less like weather and more like something deliberate. When the Lord's steward arrived at the door with his list of what was owed and his calm expectation that it would be paid, And Eleanor's mother counted out the grain with steady hands, while her expression said nothing at all. In those moments, the system's shape was visible. The system existed to extract. It was efficient at extracting. The peasants were the engine of it, and the engine was expected to run regardless of conditions, regardless of last winter's hunger or last spring's flooding, regardless of how many people in the village were sick or how many children hadn't survived the season. The manorial court met periodically, presided over by the Lord's representative, and in it, the everyday legal life of the village was conducted. Disputes between neighbors over boundaries, over pigs that had gotten into someone's garden, over debts, over the quality of the alewife was selling. Women could appear in these courts in their own right. A medieval peasant woman, widowed or unmarried, could plead her own case, which was more legal standing than many people assume women had. Eleanor's mother appeared in the court once, in a dispute over a strip of land along the northern edge of the village fields that a neighbor claimed had been incorrectly bounded. She won, not because the system was fair, but because she was right, and she had witnesses, and she stated her case clearly and without backing down. Eleanor was perhaps 12 years old, and she watched her mother stand in that court and speak firmly to the steward and the assembled neighbors, and something settled into place in her understanding of what a woman could be. The Lord's domain, his personal fields, was separated from the strips farmed by the peasants, though they were mixed together in the great open fields in a complicated pattern of ownership. When the Lord's harvest needed labor, the call went out and everyone came. These were called boon days, or beads, and during the great boon days of harvest, the August weeks when every sheaf needed to come in quickly before rain, the entire village worked together on the Lord's land. He was supposed, according to custom, to feed them on these days, bread and cheese and ale at minimum, and on the most important boon days, sometimes a full meal. This provision of food was important, both practically and symbolically. It was the Lord's acknowledgement that he was getting something real from these people, and that some minimal reciprocity was expected. Eleanor found, over years of harvest boon days, that she was good at this communal work. Not just physically capable, but good at the social dimension of it, the coordination, the rhythm, the way a large group of people working toward the same deadline develops a kind of collective momentum. She was fast with a sickle. She could tie sheaves with the efficiency that her neighbors admired, and she had a dry, quiet humor that emerged in these moments. A well-timed comment that made people around her laugh even when their backs ached and the sun was beating down. The kind of humor that is not about being funny so much as about being human, together, acknowledging the absurdity and the weight of it all without collapsing under either. What did Eleanor owe specifically as a woman? Quite a lot, actually. The idea that medieval women were confined to the house and did only domestic work is a modern misconception. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields for much of the year, hoeing, weeding, turning hay, tying sheaves, and gleaning after the harvest. Gleaning was back-raking work, going over the already harvested fields and picking up every individual grain or stalk that had been missed or dropped, stooping and straightening, for hours. It was the work assigned to the poorest and most vulnerable, women, children, the elderly, because it was the kind of work that required no specialized skill, only patience and a strong back. In addition to the field work, Eleanor's household obligations were staggering, She made the family's food from raw materials. There were no stores, no pre-made products of any kind. She kept and fed the poultry, chickens, geese, maybe ducks, which were largely considered women's domain. She milked the cow. She tended the garden. She made cheese. She spun and wove the family's cloth, because every piece of fabric anyone wore had to be made by hand from raw wool or flax. She washed clothing. She gathered herbs and foraged in the woods for mushrooms and berries and edible plants that could supplement the diet. She helped at calving time. She looked after the children. There is a poem from the late 13th century in England called Piers Plowman, written by William Langland, which contains a passage that historians often quote when they want to describe the life of the medieval peasant woman. In the poem, the speaker describes a woman who is burdened with children and overwhelmed by the rent, who spends whatever she saves from spinning on food for the house, on milk and meal to make porridge with, to quiet the crying of the children at meal times, while she herself suffers hunger, and woe in wintertime, waking at night to rock the cradle, carding and combing wool, washing and rubbing and reeling yarn, and peeling rushes for light. The poet ends by saying that the woe of these women who dwell in hovels is too sad to speak of or to say in rhyme. Eleanor could have been that woman. In many ways, she was. Part 4. What she ate and what she didn't. Sit with this for a moment, because it matters more than you might think. The food, or the absence of it, was the background music of Eleanor's entire existence. Every decision, every season, every fear was filtered through the fundamental question of whether there would be enough to eat. The staple of the peasant diet in 13th century France was bread, but not the soft, white, yeasty bread we know. Eleanor's bread was dense and dark, made from rye or barley flour, sometimes a mixture of the two, sometimes with oat flour added to stretch it further. Wheat flour, finer and more expensive, was reserved for special occasions or sold at market to bring in a little coin. The loaves were heavy and thick-crusted, baked in the communal oven on the days the Lord permitted its use. When fresh, they had a rough, earthy, slightly sour smell. They went stale and hard within 2 or 3 days, and then they were broken into bowls of hot broth or pottage to soften them. Nothing was wasted. The very last scraps of stale bread were soaked in water or broth and eaten as a kind of porridge. The bread never, in any meaningful sense, went to waste. Pottage was the other great pillar of the peasant diet. This was essentially a thick, hot soup or stew made in the iron pot that hung over the fire. The base was usually water or weak meat broth. Into it went whatever vegetables the garden and the season provided: leeks, onions, cabbages, peas, beans. In spring, the first tender shoots of nettles or dandelion or chickweed might go in. Herbs from the garden added flavoring. Sometimes a bit of salt pork if the family had any. Usually from a pig slaughtered in autumn, when the cold made it possible to preserve the meat. Sometimes dried peas or beans that had been stored from the previous harvest. Sometimes nothing at all in the pot, except vegetables and the hope that it would fill you up enough to sleep. Pottage could be thin and watery, or thick and almost solid. It was eaten for breakfast, for the midday meal, for supper, day after day, week after week. The recipe never changed dramatically, because the ingredients never changed dramatically. It was the taste of survival, not unpleasant, not undelicious, just monotonous in a way that is hard to fully imagine when you live in a world of almost infinite food variety. Ale was the universal drink, not the strong ale of a modern pub, but a weak, low-alcohol brew that was safer than water. Water from medieval wells and streams was often contaminated, and ale's brewing process killed the bacteria. Every family brewed their own ale, or bought it from a village alewife, the woman who specialized in brewing and sold it to her neighbors. Eleanor's mother brewed ale regularly. The smell of fermenting barley was as much a part of the house as the wood smoke. Children drank ale too. Everyone drank ale. Small ale it was called, with a low alcohol content that provided calories and hydration without intoxication. Dairy was important. Milk from the cow when the cow was giving, cheese made from the surplus milk, butter when they had cream enough to churn, eggs from the chickens, fish when the streams permitted and the Lord's fishing rights allowed. Meat was rarer than all of these, reserved for feast days and special occasions. Most peasant families killed a pig in late autumn, smoked and salted the meat, and tried to make it last through the winter and into spring. The pig was precious. It was fed kitchen scraps and foraged in the woodland en masse, acorns and beechnuts, and it ate almost anything. Medieval peasants loved their pigs with a practical, unsentimental tenderness because pigs represented the difference between an adequate winter and a miserable one. The seasons shape the diet in ways that people today find almost impossible to imagine. Spring was the leanest season. The stored grain and preserved food of autumn was running low. The garden wasn't producing yet. The cows were not yet in full milk. The weeks before the first spring vegetables appeared in the garden were called the hungry gap. And they were exactly that, a period when adults went to bed slightly hungry and children cried at table and mothers did the math of the remaining grain against the number of days until the first harvest and hoped. Eleanor knew the hungry gap intimately. She knew the specific quality of hunger, not dramatic, not desperate, just ever-present, a low growling at the stomach that you learned to ignore during the day and that made sleep harder at night. She knew the feeling of eating less so that the children would eat more. She knew what it meant to pour the last of the grain into the pot and then stir it slowly, trying to make it stretch, adding water, adding more water, hoping the thinness of the pottage wouldn't show too clearly on the children's faces when they looked at their bowls. The feast days, and there were many of them, built into the church calendar like oases, were the relief from all this. On feast days, if a family had anything at all to celebrate with, they celebrated. More bread, thicker pottage with actual meat in it, a cup of wine if anyone had managed to trade for it. Children running, neighbors gathered, the brief, precious, absolutely necessary joy of being alive and together and not hungry, just for one day. There were, to be fair, more dimensions to the diet than simple deprivation. Eleanor's family kept chickens, and eggs appeared in the diet with reasonable regularity in spring and summer. The hens, as in all seasons, slowed their laying in winter when daylight was short. Another way the seasons controlled everything. Mushrooms, gathered in the forest in autumn, were a delicacy that cost nothing but time and knowledge, and Eleanor became skilled at knowing which ones to pick. Wild greens, sorrel, dandelion, watercress from the stream supplemented the diet in spring when the garden was only beginning to wake. The forest provided hazelnuts and acorns. The acorns were mostly for the pigs, but hazelnuts were eaten and sometimes ground into a rough meal. Salt was essential and precious. It preserved meat, it flavored food, it was necessary in so many processes of domestic life that it was traded and taxed and managed like a commodity of genuine importance, which it was. A family that ran out of salt in midwinter was in trouble. Eleanor kept hers in a small wooden box near the fire where it would stay dry, and she used it carefully, measuring with the knowledge of someone who knows the difference between enough and too much very well. The communal oven operated on designated days, and Eleanor would bring her loaves of shaped dough there to be baked, carrying them on a flat wooden board. The oven was a large dome of mud and brick, heated by burning wood inside it until the walls were white hot. Then the ash was raked out and the loaves slid in on long-handled wooden peels. It baked everything in a single sustained heat. First the bread, when the oven was hottest, then dishes that needed lower heat as it cooled. The women often gathered around the oven on baking days, waiting for their turn, talking while the bread baked. It was one of the few genuinely social moments built into the ordinary week. Eleanor's mother had been known for her bread. She added caraway seeds to one of her loaves, a small luxury that people in the village mentioned even years after she was gone. Eleanor tried to replicate it and never quite managed, and she baked caraway loaves for the rest of her life, partly as a way of trying to reach back toward her mother's particular knowledge of the dough. The mill was another gathering point, though less pleasant. The walk to the mill with a sack of grain on your back was a significant physical effort, and the miller was not universally liked. He had a reputation, as millers did across medieval Europe, for giving back slightly less flour than the grain warranted, pocketing the difference. Whether this was true of every miller or was simply a prejudice that attached itself to the profession is hard to say. But Eleanor knew to watch, as her mother had taught her to watch, when the grain went in and the flour came out. You paid your toll and took your flour, and you walked home, heavier in meal and lighter in patience, and the bread you made from it was your bread, and you were grateful for it, regardless. Part 5. Eleanor becomes a wife. By the time she was 17, Eleanor was ready to be married, or rather, the village was ready for her to be married, which in practice amounted to the same thing. In the medieval peasant world, marriage was not primarily a love story. It was a practical arrangement, an economic partnership that made sense because the farm could not be run by one person alone. A man needed a wife's labor. A woman needed a man's access to land. Without land, a woman had almost no means of supporting herself independently. Without a wife, a man could barely manage the household economy alongside the field work. So they found each other, these young people, in the way that young people in small communities always find each other. At church, at the communal well, at the Lord's harvest boon when all the village worked side by side in the August heat, and arrangements were made. The man who would become Eleanor's husband was called Raoul. He was a few years older than her, the son of a family from the neighboring village, which meant the Lord's permission was needed for the marriage. Eleanor was bound to Châtelier, and marrying her away to another village required formal approval and the payment of the merchant fee. The arrangements took time. Her father negotiated with Raoul's father. The Lord's steward was consulted. A fee was agreed upon, and then, on a Sunday morning in early summer, Eleanor and Raoul stood at the door of the church, the most public place in the village, where everyone could witness and therefore validate the ceremony, and spoke their vows. The priest asked if there were any impediments. He asked aloud 3 times on 3 successive Sundays before the wedding day, calling out their names and asking if anyone knew a reason they could not be married. A previous betrothal, a kinship too close within the degrees the church forbade. No one spoke. Raoul named the dower he would provide for Eleanor, a small portion of his land that would be hers should he die first. He placed a ring on the 4th finger of her right hand because medieval theologians believed there was a vein running directly from that finger to the heart. He gave her a small sum of money to be distributed to the poor. The words were simple. The ceremony was brief, but the celebration after was not brief. Weddings, even peasant weddings, were occasions for the entire village. Al was drunk in considerable quantities. What food people had was shared. There was music, probably a pipe or a fiddle played by someone in the village who had some talent, nothing professional or elaborate, just someone who could keep a tune going long enough for dancing. And people danced. Even in hard lives, especially in hard lives, people found ways to dance at weddings, to stamp their feet on the hard dirt and swing each other around and laugh. The body wanted joy. The body always wanted joy. Eleanor had that on her wedding day. She had joy. She moved to Raoul's village, leaving Chatelier's behind, leaving her parents. Her sister Agnes, who was now nearly grown herself, the church she had walked to every Sunday of her life, the path through the fields she could have walked blindfolded. She carried her small chest of belongings in a cart, and she turned and looked back once at the cluster of rooftops disappearing behind the trees, and then she faced forward and tried to be glad. She had known Raoul for perhaps 2 years before the marriage, in the way you know people from neighboring villages, by sight and by reputation, and by the occasional meeting at the market or at a saint's feast day when people from several villages gathered. He was quiet. He worked hard. He had a steadiness about him that she had noticed, and that her father had also noted approvingly. The steadiness of someone who was not going to be rattled by difficulty, who was going to keep showing up for the field work and the animal care and the 100 practical necessities of the farm, regardless of weather or mood or misfortune. This was not a small virtue in the world Eleanor inhabited. It was, in fact, one of the most important virtues available. She did not know him well when they married. This was normal. The knowledge came after, built through the years of shared labor and shared space, and the gradual, unremarkable accumulation of knowing another person's ways. She learned that he was patient with animals but impatient with rain, that he ate slowly and chewed thoroughly in a way that slightly irritated her at first, and then became simply the sound of supper, that he snored, that he was better with the children than she had expected, not demonstratively affectionate, but reliable in small ways, present in the ways that mattered, there to help with the heavy work of keeping young children alive and uninjured in a world full of sharp tools and open fires and deep wells. She learned that when something genuinely frightened him, he went very quiet, not withdrawn, just still. The way an animal goes still when it senses danger. She learned to read this stillness and respond to it by doing the same, by staying quiet and steady beside him until the fear passed or until action became necessary. This mirroring was not something they ever discussed. It just happened, the way most of the communication between people who live very close together for a long time happens. Through. Small adjustments, through the gradual learning of each other's silences as much as each other's words. Raoul was not a cruel man. This matters because cruelty was possible and not uncommon. He was taciturn and weathered and very much focused on the practical business of keeping their farm going. But he was not cruel. He worked alongside Eleanor in the fields. He did not beat her. He brought her a bunch of herbs once, early in their marriage, in a moment of uncharacteristic softness, and then seemed embarrassed by it, and she never mentioned it again. But she kept the herbs long after they dried and crumbled, because the gesture had been so unexpected and therefore precious. Their marriage was, in the way of most peasant marriages, a partnership in the fullest and most literal sense. Every single thing that the household needed, food, clothing, warmth, water, the management of animals, the planting and harvesting of crops, the endless cycle of labor, required both of them. One was not more important than the other in terms of what the household absolutely needed to function. The field work and the housework were equally essential, equally exhausting, and if there was no romance in it, in the courtly sense of that word, there was nonetheless a kind of intimacy. The intimacy of people who work side by side every day for decades, who know each other's rhythms as well as their own, who can read exhaustion or illness or sadness in each other's movements without needing to ask. Part 6. The Children and the Grief. Eleanor's first child was born in the winter of 1249 or 1250, when she was probably around 19 or 20 years old. She had no midwife by modern standards. There was no formally trained professional who came to help. There was the village wise woman, an older widow who had attended dozens of births and knew the herbs and the techniques and the prayers. There was Eleanor's neighbor, a woman called Matilda, who had had 5 children of her own and knew what to do. There was Raoul, waiting outside, praying in the cold. Childbirth in the 13th century was a dangerous thing. Not just uncomfortable, not just painful, but genuinely, statistically dangerous. Historical records suggest that roughly 20% of women in medieval Europe died in childbirth or from complications related to it. Eleanor knew this. Every woman knew this. You went into labor knowing it might be the last thing you did. You prayed to the Virgin Mary, whose intercession was considered especially powerful in matters of childbirth. And you asked the wise woman for her herbs and her knowledge. And you gripped something solid, and you endured. Eleanor's first child was a boy. He came into the world in the small hours of a February morning, born into the firelight and the smoke and the smell of blood and straw. And he was alive. And he cried, and Eleanor wept with relief and held him against her chest and felt his heart beating against hers. And that was one of the most perfect moments of her life. She named him Thomas, and for 11 days she nursed him and held him and watched his face with that specific attention mothers bring to newborns. The way they catalog every feature, every tiny movement, as if trying to memorize something they already know is fleeting. On the 12th day, Thomas died. There is no surviving record of this. There never was. The deaths of infant peasant children in 13th century France were so common that they were not recorded anywhere. They happened, and then they were absorbed into the general silence of history. But they happened. Research into medieval mortality rates suggests that roughly half of all children born in this period did not survive past their first year. Half. This is a number that needs a moment to settle. For every 2 children born in Eleanor's village, 1 would die before it was old enough to walk. Dysentery, pneumonia, infections, simply the cold and the hunger and the fragility of new life in a world without medicine, without warmth, without sanitation. Eleanor lost Thomas. She did what her mother had done before her and what her neighbors would do after her. She held him until she had to let him go. And then she let him go. She asked the priest to pray over him. She buried him in the churchyard at the edge of the village. She stood at the grave in the February cold, her face blank in the way faces go blank when grief is too large to show. And Raoul stood beside her, and there were no words. Medieval people who lose children are sometimes said by historians to have felt it less than we do. To have been less attached to infant death was so common. To have held themselves back from loving too deeply something so likely to be taken away. This is, at best, unproven, and at worst, profoundly wrong. The evidence we have, from prayers, from church records of requests for intercession on behalf of sick children, from the fragments of personal writing that survive from this period, suggests that parents grieved deeply, that they loved their children desperately, knowing full well they might lose them, and lost them anyway, and carried that loss for the rest of their lives. Eleanor loved her children desperately. She would have 2 more who survived past infancy. A girl, Blanche, born around 1252, who was tough and quick and made it through childhood with a kind of determined ferocity, and a boy, Etienne, born perhaps 4 years later, who was gentle and somewhat fragile, but who also survived, who grew up to help his father in the fields, and eventually marry a girl from the neighboring village. And she lost 2 others, 1 stillborn, 1 who lived for 3 months and then slipped away on a summer morning with the flies buzzing at the window and the birds singing outside as if nothing had happened. The grief of those losses was not something Eleanor talked about because there was no real language for it in her world. You prayed. You trusted that God had taken your child to a better place. And this was not simply a saying, not simply a consolation. Eleanor genuinely believed it. The faith was real and deep and not metaphorical. Her children were with God. She would see them again. This belief did not eliminate the ache in her chest when she thought of Thomas, when she walked past the churchyard and paused at the small unmarked mound. But it made the ache bearable. It gave it a shape, and having a shape, a framework, was better than having nothing. Part 7. The body that bore everything. By the time Eleanor was 35, she had the body of a much older woman by modern standards. Not ugly, not ruined, just marked. Aged by work and weather, and childbearing and the ordinary accumulations of a hard life. Her hands were rough and strong. Her back ached in cold weather, a deep, structural ache from years of bending over garden rows and harvest fields, of carrying heavy loads, water, grain, wood, balanced on her head or her hip, the way women in many cultures have always carried things. Her teeth were not good. Medieval dental care was essentially non-existent, and a diet high in rough grain and low in calcium and vitamins took its toll. Her eyesight, which had been sharp in youth, was beginning to soften around the edges. When she was sick, she used what was available. The village wise woman knew herbs, willow bark for pain and fever, which we know now contains a precursor to aspirin, chamomile and valerian for sleep and calm, garlic for infections, plantain leaves for wounds. This was not nothing. Some of these remedies had genuine efficacy, but when Raoul developed a fever in the autumn of Eleanor's 32nd year, when the fever climbed and his breathing became rough and he lay on the pallet shaking with chills, despite the fire burning high, the herbs and the prayers and the wise woman's knowledge were not enough. He died after 10 days. He was perhaps 37 years old. The formal medicine available in the 13th century was almost entirely inaccessible to people like Eleanor. Physicians, trained at universities like the one in Paris or Montpellier, existed, but they served wealthy clients in cities. Their methods, had Eleanor been able to access them, would have involved humoral theory. The idea, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness was an imbalance among them. The treatments this theory suggested included bloodletting, purging, and adjusting the diet. Bloodletting, opening a vein and draining a measured quantity of blood, was considered appropriate for fevers, infections, and many other conditions. It almost certainly did more harm than good in most cases, draining patients who were already weakened and providing no benefit whatsoever against bacterial infection or viral illness. But it was the best theory available, and physicians practiced it with genuine conviction. Eleanor had no physician. She had the wise woman, the herbs, the prayers, and the community. When someone was seriously ill in the village, neighbors came. They brought food. They sat with the sick person so the family could sleep. They helped with the outdoor work that couldn't be left undone simply because someone was ill inside. The network of mutual aid that village life created was not romantic or idealized. It was practical and deeply necessary, because without it, illness in one household rippled out into catastrophe for everyone connected to it. You helped your neighbors when they were sick because you knew with absolute certainty that one day you would need the same from them. Childbirth was the particular danger that shadowed every woman's life. The wise woman at a birth knew things. She knew how to help a baby turn if it was presenting the wrong way. She knew which herbs helped with pain and which ones helped slow excessive bleeding. She knew how to encourage a labor that was stalling. She knew how to tell the difference between a labor that was going normally and one that was going wrong. What she could not do was perform surgery, sterilize instruments, administer antibiotics, manage blood transfusions. When childbirth went badly in the medieval world, it usually went fatally. This was simply the terrain of being a woman, as fixed and immovable as the seasons. Eleanor understood this. She took it into account in her prayers, in her management of risk, in the way she helped other women in the village when their time came, with presence and calm and knowledge and the quiet reassurance that someone experienced was there. She herself had come close, she believed, with Etienne's birth. The labor had been very long, more than a day, and there had been a period in the dark hours of the second night when the wise woman's face had carried an expression that Eleanor, even in her exhaustion, had understood. She had prayed then, with an intensity she never quite equaled again, the words running through her mind in a steady stream, the Ave Maria, repeating itself like a rhythm, like a heartbeat, like something you hold on to when everything else is uncertain. And then Etienne had arrived, small and furious, and the night had turned around, and Eleanor had held him against her chest in the same posture she had held Thomas. And this time the heart kept beating, and he kept crying, and she kept weeping with relief until there was nothing left to weep. The fear of that night stayed with her, not the memory of the pain. The pain faded, as people always say it does, but the memory of that interval of genuine uncertainty, of not knowing, of being in the hands of something larger than any herb or prayer could control, and knowing it. She had learned, in that night, something about the texture of real fear. And she had also learned something about what comes after fear. The extraordinary sweetness of the morning, the specific gratitude of being alive, the way the ordinary world looks different when you have just been reminded how close it is to not existing at all. This loss was different from the deaths of children. Those had been devastating, but also, in some way, familiar. Every family lost children, and there were rituals for it, and words, and the comfort of shared grief. Losing Raoul was like losing the architecture of her life. He had been the other half of everything. The farm, the strips of land, the rhythm of daily work, all of it had been built for two people working together. Alone, with two children and a farm to maintain, Eleanor was in genuine difficulty. She did what widowed peasant women did. She asked for help from her neighbors, and they gave it, because this was how village life worked. The labor was collective, the hardship was shared, and everyone knew that they might be next. Her son Etienne, who was perhaps 8 or 9 at the time, took on more of the field work. Blanche, 12 or 13, took on more of the housework. Eleanor herself worked harder than she ever had, and she had never stopped working. She managed. She paid the Harriet. She gave up the best of the animals to the Lord's steward, who came with the kind of apologetic embarrassment that characterized good stewards doing bad jobs. She retained the land. She kept the strips, farming them herself, and with the help of neighbors. Medieval manorial records occasionally capture widows like Eleanor, women farming small holdings, appearing in court records to defend their rights, paying their rents, managing somehow. They were not unusual. They were not celebrated. They were simply present, doing what had to be done, with a quiet competence that the records can barely contain. Eleanor did not remarry, though she might have. Men who lost their wives often remarried quickly because they needed the household labor. Widows remarried too, for the same practical reasons. But Eleanor, in her late 30s, seems to have decided against it. Or perhaps no suitable arrangement presented itself. Or perhaps she found, to her own surprise, a certain austere freedom in running the household entirely on her own terms. The grief of losing Raoul never fully left her, but grief, she had learned, was not an obstacle to living. It was something you carried with you as you lived, the way you carried everything else, with your hands, with your back, with your whole body. Part 8. God and the Saints and the Sound of Bells. I want to talk to you about Eleanor's faith, because it was not incidental to her life. It was the air she breathed, the framework on which everything else hung. And I think it is easy for us, from a distance of 8 centuries, to misunderstand what that faith looked like in practice. She was not a theologian. She could not read. She had no access to the Bible in any direct sense. It was written in Latin, which she did not speak, and even if a priest had translated passages for her, she would have encountered them as spoken words, not as text. What she had was the church building itself, which was a kind of visual Bible, the stained glass windows which told stories in color and light, the carved figures above the doorways, the painted walls inside depicting scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin and the saints. She had the liturgy of the Mass, said in Latin, whose words she did not understand, but whose rhythms she knew as well as her own heartbeat. She had the prayers she had memorized in childhood, the Pater Noster, the Our Father, the Ave Maria, the Hail Mary, which she said in Latin as a kind of incantation, not because she didn't care what they meant, but because meaning in Eleanor's religious world was less important than the act itself, the act of prayer, the turning of attention toward God, the acknowledgement repeated daily that she was small and the world was large and she was not alone in it. The bells of the church structured her entire day. Medieval Christians organized their lives around the canonical hours, the 8 prayer times that marked the day from before dawn to after dark. The bells rang for matins, before first light. They rang for prime, at sunrise, for terce, mid-morning, for sext, at noon, for none, in the mid-afternoon, for vespers as the sun went down, for compline as it grew dark. Eleanor did not attend all these services. She was not a monk or a nun, and she had a farm to run. But she heard the bells. All day long the bells of the village church marked the passage of time, and each peal was a small reminder of something larger than the field she was working in, then the pot she was stirring, then the cold that was seeping under the door. The sound of those bells was, in a very real sense, the organizing principle of Eleanor's sense of time. She didn't have a clock. She didn't need one. The bells were the clock, and before the bells, the sun and the seasons were the clock. You knew what time it was by the quality of the light, by the warmth or cold of the air, by which field work needed doing. The day had a shape that was determined by the body's hunger and weariness, and the sun's position in the sky, and the bells provided the commentary. This hour, now, this hour, now, keeping the living world synchronized with the sacred one. The priest of Eleanor's village was a man she knew all her life, or rather, a succession of men she knew all her life, because priests came and went while the village stayed. The priest she remembered most clearly from her childhood was a young man from a prosperous peasant family in the next valley, who had been sent to the church because he was the younger son and there was not enough land for all the boys. He had learned his Latin haltingly, and his Mass was sometimes rushed, and he had a liking for ale that occasionally made itself visible on Sunday mornings. But he was also genuinely kind. And when Eleanor's mother was dying, slowly, over the course of a winter, from some illness of the chest that went on and on, he came to the house often, and he held her hand and said the prayers, and he wept at her burial. And that mattered to Eleanor more than any theological correctness could have. She was, by modern standards, what you might call a practical Catholic. She observed the feasts and the fasts. She went to Mass on Sundays. She made her confession at Easter as required. She prayed daily. But she also kept a bundle of dried herbs tied with a particular knot above her door, because her mother had always done it, and it kept bad fortune away. She threw a handful of salt over her left shoulder when she spilled some, because the salt drove away evil. She knew certain words to say when a child was sick, words that were not quite a prayer, but not a prayer either, old words in a form of the vernacular that sounded half magical. The church condemned all of this as superstition. Eleanor did it anyway, as her mother had done it, and her mother's mother before that, because the faith and the folk magic were not in her understanding separate systems, but parts of the same thing, the same reaching toward protection, toward safety, toward whatever powers might be persuaded to let the children live. She confessed the folk magic to the priest sometimes, who told her not to do it and assigned her a small penance. And then she went home and did it again, because it had always worked before, or at least nothing terrible had happened while she was doing it, which amounted to the same thing. The pilgrimage was the great spiritual adventure available to a medieval peasant, and Eleanor made one in her early 40s, a journey on foot to the shrine of St. James at a monastery about 3 days' walk from her village. She went with 2 neighbors, Mathilde and a woman called Agnes, who was unrelated to her sister. They walked for 3 days each way, sleeping in roadside inns or in the barns of hospitable farmhouses, eating what they had brought and what kind people gave them. The road was full of other pilgrims, some from great distances, on journeys that would last months and cover hundreds of miles. Eleanor and her companions were minor pilgrims by comparison, but the road made everyone equal. She talked to a merchant from Paris who was walking to atone for something he would not quite name. She talked to an old woman from a village even smaller than her own, who had been making this same journey every year for 20 years, because it was the only time in her life she was completely free. The shrine itself, the dim interior of the monastery church, the press of bodies, the incense, the chanting monks, the relic in its gold reliquary that you could file past and touch, moved Eleanor in ways she could not articulate. She cried, standing there, not from sadness exactly, from the feeling of being inside something much larger than herself, of being one small, warm body in a current that flowed back and forward through time, connecting her to every other person who had ever stood in that place and reached toward the same thing. She touched the reliquary with her rough, calloused hand and asked for protection for her children, for healing for Raoul, who was already showing the signs of the illness that would kill him, for gratitude for what she had been given, for the strength to carry what was coming. Then she filed out into the sunshine and stood blinking, and Matilda took her arm, and they walked home. She never forgot it. In the remaining decades of her life, she returned to the memory of that moment often, especially in the hardest times, a touchstone, a reminder that however small and confined her daily world was, she was part of something that had no perceptible edges. The saints were her particular intimates, not abstract figures, but specific presences, personalities with preferences and powers and histories. Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin, was the patron of women in labor, and Eleanor had prayed to her with desperate intensity at every childbirth. Saint Blaise was invoked for sore throats, Saint Sebastian for plague. The Virgin Mary, above all, was the great intercessor, the mother who understood grief, who had watched her own child die, and who could therefore be trusted to understand what it was to lose a child. Eleanor's small clay figure of the Virgin sat on the shelf by the hearth for decades, and Eleanor spoke to it in the mornings, quietly, while she was building up the fire, in the same way she might have spoken to a friend. The church calendar gave the year its shape. Advent, the 4 solemn weeks before Christmas, was a time of fasting and anticipation. Christmas itself, the 12 days of it, was one of the great celebrations of the year, a time when even the Lord might be expected to provide a feast for his tenants, when the workday was suspended, when the village came together. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was another period of fasting, which for a peasant who was already often hungry was not an abstract spiritual discipline, but a real and physical trial. Then Easter, the greatest feast of all, the resurrection and the renewal, when the church was decorated with fresh green branches and the priest wore his white vestments, and the sense of joy after the long winter fast was almost physical in its intensity. May Day was not a religious feast exactly, but the whole village celebrated it. It was the 1st of May, the beginning of real summer, and people went out into the fields and woods to gather flowers and green branches to decorate the house and the church. And there was dancing and singing and the general loosening that comes when winter is finally, definitively over. Eleanor loved May Day. Even in her 50s, even with her aching back, she would go out in the early morning to gather the first hawthorn blossoms, white and heavily fragrant, and she would carry them home and hang them at the door and breathe them in. The harvest festival in August, after the grain was in, this was the other great communal celebration of the year. Lammas, it was called in the English tradition, though the French equivalent was similar in spirit. The last sheaf of wheat was cut with ceremony, and afterward there was feasting and drinking and music and that particular quality of relief that only comes after sustained collective effort has succeeded. The grain was in. You were, for now, safe. The world was generous and the harvest had been good, and you were alive, and your children were fed, and whatever came next, this moment was sweet. Peasants in medieval France had roughly 8 weeks of holidays across the year, feast days and Sundays on which work was not required. 8 weeks of rest scattered through 52 of labor. It was not enough in any modern calculation, but it was something. It was the punctuation that kept the long sentence of hard work from becoming simply unbearable. Part 9. The Seasons of a Long Life. Eleanor lived, by the standards of her time and place, a reasonably long life. The average life expectancy at birth in medieval Europe was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. But this number is dragged down heavily by the catastrophic infant and child mortality rates. People who survived childhood and made it to adulthood often lived much longer, to 50, to 60, occasionally beyond. Eleanor, tough and weathered and sustained by her faith and her community, made it into her late 50s. The seasons of her long life were the seasons of the earth. Spring, the hope and the work of planting, the exhausting, beautiful optimism of seeds going into the ground again, the anxious watching of the sky for rain. Summer, the heat and the relentless labor of haymaking and weeding, and the building tension toward harvest. Autumn, the harvest itself, the most intensive work of the year, the all-hands-on-deck urgency of bringing everything in before the rain came, before the cold came, before the season turned, and winter, the dark season, the quiet season, the season of sitting by the fire and spinning and waiting and praying that what you had stored would be enough. Spring was Eleanor's most emotionally complicated season. The return of warmth always brought something close to giddiness. The first morning, you could work outside without your breath clouding. The first morning the birds were truly loud in the trees. The first day warm enough to go without a wool wrap on your shoulders. After months of cold and dark and confinement, these moments arrived with an almost painful brightness. The whole village seemed to exhale in early April. Children who had been cooped inside all winter burst out of doors. Dogs ran. There was noise and movement and color, returning to a world that had been uniformly gray and brown for what felt like forever. But spring also brought the hungry gap and the anxiety that went with it. And in the fields, spring brought the back-breaking work of preparation, plowing the winter field, manuring it if there was dung enough, turning the earth and harrowing it and getting the seed in at the right time, before the soil dried out or another rain came. Missing the planting window could cost you the whole crop. The relationship between the peasant and the soil during planting season was intimate and tense. You watched the field the way you watched a sick child for signs of what was happening beneath the surface. Summer had its own particular quality of time. The long days meant long work days, and the pace of summer was relentless. There was always something growing that needed attention, always a hedgerow to cut or a ditch to clear, always more hay to turn and dry, always weeding, always weeding. The medieval open fields had no herbicides. You controlled weeds by hand and by hoe, and the weeds grew back immediately, and you weeded again. Eleanor's lower back, by the time she was 40, was the repository of 30 years of this, of bending and straightening, bending and straightening. In the summer heat, with the sun on her neck and the sweat running down her face, and the relentless, undramatic, muscle-building work of keeping the crops clear. And yet, summer also had its pleasures, in the way that all seasons did when you were paying full attention. The evenings were long and warm. After supper, you could sit outside on a bench against the south wall of the house and feel the day's stored heat in the stone and watch the swallows cutting their impossible shapes against the deepening sky. The village had a particular summer smell. Warm earth, ripening grain, flowering hedgerows, the occasional sweetness of beans in bloom. There was a large walnut tree at the edge of the village common, ancient and enormous, that provided deep shade on hot days and nuts in autumn. And Eleanor loved that tree with a specific loyalty she would have found hard to explain. She had climbed it as a child. She had sat under it with Raoul on a warm evening early in their marriage. She had cracked walnuts beneath it with her grandchildren. The tree was older than anyone in the village, older than the village itself, perhaps. And it stood there with the patience of something that has watched many generations pass and is not particularly concerned about any of them. Autumn was the most beautiful and most terrifying season simultaneously. Beautiful because the light turned golden and the fields went bronze, and the forest put on its brief, extravagant show of color before dropping everything and going bare. Beautiful because the harvest, when it was good, produced a feeling of completion that nothing else in the year could match. The full barn, the stacked grain, the sense that you had done what needed to be done and the winter would be bearable. Terrifying because it could go wrong so easily. A week of rain at the wrong moment. Hail, early frost, animals getting into the stored grain. The margin between adequate and catastrophic was thin in a way that people who have not experienced it cannot fully imagine. And Eleanor was never, in any autumn of her life, entirely free of the anxiety that ran alongside the beauty like a shadow. Winter was the season of inwardness, the long, dark evenings by the fire, the mending and the spinning, the storytelling that Eleanor had learned from her mother and passed on to her children and grandchildren. Not great epics or courtly tales, but small stories, local stories, stories about the village and the saints and the things that had happened in living memory, and older things that had been passed down so many times their origins were invisible. A child who had been frightened by something, a woman who had found a way through a difficulty. Small human stories, the kind that don't make history, but make life. She learned in winter to value smallness. The circle of firelight, that was enough. The warmth of another body sleeping close by. The weight of a sleeping child on your lap. The satisfaction of a well-mended garment. The seam straight and strong, made to last another year. There was a kind of contentment available in winter, in the enforced slowness of it, that the busy seasons didn't offer. A permission to stop. Eleanor came over the decades to understand this permission as a gift rather than a deprivation. The world was asking her to rest. The world was telling her, the fields are bare and frozen, and nothing needs doing that can't wait. Sit down, stay warm, be still for a while. This was not something she had been taught. It was something she worked out slowly, by herself, through the long winters of a long life. She watched her children grow. She watched Blanche marry and move to a nearby village, and she missed her daughter with a pain that was almost physical, the same pain she had felt when she herself had left Chatelier's 40 years before. She helped Etienne build his life on the strips of land that had been their family's for 3 generations. She became a grandmother twice, 3 times, eventually more, though not all of them survived to adulthood, because no generation was spared that particular grief. She got older, the work got harder as her body aged, and she scaled back. Less field work, more of the lighter domestic labor. She spun, she tended the garden. She helped at calving time when her hands were still strong enough. She sat by the fire in the evenings and watched her grandchildren playing in the small space of the house. And sometimes she told them things, old stories probably, or things she had heard at church, or simply facts about the land and the seasons and the village that she wanted them to know. She was not literate. She would leave no written record. Everything she knew and everything she had been would pass from the world with her, filtered through the memories of the people who loved her. What she had accumulated over 50-plus years of living was not property. She had little of that. It was not status. She was a peasant woman in a small French village, and the world outside her valley barely knew she existed. What she had accumulated was something harder to name, a kind of knowing. She knew how to read the sky for weather. She knew which plants healed and which ones harmed. She knew how to manage a household on almost nothing. How to make a thin pottage taste like something. How to coax a fire from damp wood. How to comfort a child who was afraid of the dark. How to hold someone who was dying. She had loved people and lost them. She had worked until her body ached in ways that didn't fully go away. She had been hungry and cold and exhausted and frightened. She had also danced at weddings and sung in church and held her new grandchildren in her arms and felt the May sunshine on her face, and drunk ale at harvest with her neighbors, and laughed at things that were genuinely funny, and felt, in those moments, completely and fully alive. This is what a life was in the 13th century. In a village in France, one woman, one house, one fire, one long span of seasons, turning and turning and turning. Part 10. The last night. It is autumn now. The year is somewhere around 1285. Eleanor is in her mid-50s, which in this world and this body means old. She has known for some months that she is failing, not from any single catastrophic illness, just the accumulated weight of all those years settling into her bones, slowing her down, making the stairs harder and the cold worse, and the mornings more reluctant to begin. Her daughter-in-law, the wife of her son Etienne, has been caring for her, making her pottage, building up the fire, making sure the blankets are thick. It is a kindness Eleanor is not entirely comfortable with. She has spent her whole life caring for others, and being cared for feels strange, the wrong way around. But she has accepted it with the same quiet pragmatism with which she has accepted everything. Tonight, she is lying on a pallet near the hearth. The fire is burning low but steady, its orange light moving on the walls, filling the small room with a familiar smoky warmth. Outside, the autumn wind is doing its thing, pushing against the shuttered window, finding the gaps in the thatch and whistling through them, bending the trees at the edge of the village, rinsing the stars, clean and cold. Eleanor's hands are folded on her chest. They are rough and calloused and strong. Even now, the hands of someone who has worked every day of her life. She is thinking, if she is thinking, of her children, of Thomas, the first one who lived 11 days and has been waiting for her. She believes with her whole heart, ever since, of the sound of the bells in the mornings, of the feel of a handful of good earth, of the hawthorn blossoms in May. She is not afraid. She has been afraid many times in her life, afraid of famine, of sickness, of losing people she loved, of the long winters, but not now. Now she is simply tired in the way that is not exhaustion but completion, a tiredness that has no need to become anything else. She closes her eyes. The fire pops once, softly. Outside, the wind moves through the village, past the church and the miller's house and the garden where she grew cabbages for 30 years, past the fields that are stubbled and quiet now that the harvest is in, past the churchyard where Raoul and Thomas and 2 unnamed others wait in the cold ground. The night settles around her, thick and quiet as a wool blanket. And Eleanor, who was born in autumn and lived a whole entire life in the space between one harvest and another, breathes slowly and more slowly, and at last, without drama, without ceremony, without anyone remarkable noticing, simply rests. Part 11. What she left behind. Eleanor of the village left behind no name in any record that has survived. She left behind no letters, no diaries, no possessions of particular value. If there was ever a grave marker with her name on it, it has long since returned to the earth. What she left behind was this: 2 children who survived to adulthood and had children of their own, who had children of their own, in a chain that continues, possibly, in some unbroken thread, down to people alive today. She left behind the garden she tended for 30 years, the soil of which she enriched with her labor and her compost and her care. She left behind the knowledge she transmitted, the herb lore, the weather reading, the 1,000 practical wisdoms of keeping a household alive through winter after winter. She left behind the memory her grandchildren carried of a grandmother who told stories by the fire and smelled of wood smoke and thyme and had very strong hands. She left behind also this, a kind of evidence, not evidence of greatness, not evidence of extraordinary achievement, but evidence of a human life completely and fully lived within its constraints. Evidence that ordinary people in hard circumstances are not simply victims of their circumstances, that they also laugh and love and find joy in hawthorn blossoms and harvest ale, that they carry grief with a grace that is neither resignation nor defeat, but simply the human refusal to be destroyed by what cannot be changed, that they work and work and work, and in the spaces between the work, they are completely and fully themselves. The medieval world was hard. It was constrained and unjust, and often brutal. The feudal system extracted enormous labor from people who had almost no power to refuse. Illness and infant death and famine were constant and cruel companions. Women occupied a subordinate position in law, and in the social order, their autonomy limited, their voices rarely recorded. None of this is romantic. None of it should be wished for. And yet, the people who lived in it were not simply sufferers. They were full human beings. They had humor and tenderness and the capacity for joy. They had communities that sustained them with a density of relationship we can barely imagine in our fragmented modern world. They had faith, not naive, not unexamined, but real and deep and structuring. A faith that made the losses bearable and the beauty more beautiful, because it was understood as a gift. They had the satisfaction of physical work that produced real, tangible results. Bread from grain you planted and milled yourself, warmth from wood you cut and carried, clothing from wool you spun and wove with your own hands. There was something in all that labor, something about knowing exactly where your food came from and what it cost, that we have traded away and occasionally miss, even if we wouldn't trade back. I think about Eleanor sometimes when I'm in the middle of an ordinary day that isn't going particularly well, when I'm tired or frustrated or overwhelmed by the particular modern variety of too much to do and too little time. I think about her getting up before dawn in a cold house, pulling her rough dress over her head, banking the fire, stepping out into a February morning that would make most of us stay in bed. I think about her walking to the field with her tools on her shoulder and the stars still showing overhead, and I think she did this every day of her life. She did this when she was grieving and when she was sick and when she was hungry and when she was frightened and when she was so tired she could barely lift her feet. And she also did it on the days when the light was good and the work was satisfying and the neighbors were company and the bread she had baked that morning tasted right. She was not a hero. She did not want to be a hero. She wanted enough to eat and healthy children and the occasional feast day and the familiar sound of church bells in the morning and the warmth of a fire at the end of the day. She wanted what all of us want in the end. Not greatness, but sufficiency. Not glory, but peace. And on most of the days of her long life, in among all the difficulty and the loss and the labor, She had it imperfectly, incompletely, surrounded by hardship, dependent on the goodwill of a world that was not reliably kind. But she had it. A life. Her life. Entirely and irreducibly hers. Part 12. Coming home to sleep. You have been listening for a long time, and you have traveled a long way, across 8 centuries and an ocean, into a tiny house in a French village that no longer exists, into the life of a woman whose name I invented, but whose existence was entirely real. There were tens of thousands of Eleanors. There are records, fragments, hints of them. In the manorial court rolls and the tithe records, and the occasional rare personal document, we catch glimpses of these women, living and working, and losing and enduring. I hope as you've been listening that Eleanor's world has felt real to you, that you could smell the wood smoke and feel the cold of a February morning and hear the church bells marking the hours of a day that began before dawn. I hope you could feel the weight of her iron pot and the texture of the rough bread and the particular exhaustion that comes after a harvest day. And I hope that somewhere in that exhaustion and that weight, you also felt something softer, the warmth of the fire, the sound of children sleeping, the comfort of a faith that held the darkness at bay, the simple, radical fact of a woman lying down at the end of the day and resting. Because that is what Eleanor is doing right now, wherever she is. She has closed her eyes. The fire is burning low. The wind is in the thatch. And she is resting with the totality of someone who has earned it, who has given everything she has, every day, to the people and the land and the life she was given. Now you can do the same. Let your breathing slow down. Let the weight of your day settle, the way Eleanor's always settled when she finally lay down on her straw pallet, not disappearing, but no longer urgent, no longer something you have to carry upright. The world is quiet around you. Whatever needs to be done tomorrow can wait until tomorrow. Whatever you were worrying about can wait. Right now, there is only the dark and the warmth and the soft sound of the night outside and the slow, peaceful pull of sleep. You have worked today. You have existed today. That is enough. That has always been enough. Eleanor understood this. She learned it the hard way, through 50-some years of a life that asked more of her than seemed fair, and she learned it anyway. That rest is not laziness. That lying down is not defeat. That closing your eyes at the end of the day and giving yourself over to sleep is the most human thing you can do. It is what connects you across all that time to every person who has ever lived in a small house in a dark world and been grateful for the warmth and the quiet. Close your eyes. Follow Eleanor into the dark. It's safe here. It's warm. The fire is steady. The bells have rung their last for the night. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that you need to do right now except this. Sleep well, sleep long, and wake tomorrow, as Eleanor always did, to the bells, to the fire, to the new day asking you again for everything you have. Thank you for spending this evening with Eleanor and with me. If this story helped you rest, I'd love it if you left a comment below. It means the world, and it helps more people find their way to this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more stories like this, one waiting for you. Stories that will carry you gently out of your day and into the quiet. Press that notification bell too, so you never miss a new one. And until next time, rest well. Take care of yourselves. Good night.